episode of When Life Feels Messy. I am one of your wonderful hosts, Erin Raspberry.
Hello, wonderful listeners. I'm your other wonderful host, Ashley Ferreira.
And we are super excited for our 20th episode here because we have a wonderful special guest, Dr. Rakhi Sen. And I'm just going to let her give us a little brief intro to herself before you lovely listeners get to hear from her today. So, Rakhi.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Rakhi Sen. I'm a licensed psychologist at CAPS. I'm based on the Denton campus, and I really love working with our students. And we do see a lot of trauma work that happens in this context. So I guess lots to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she's awesome. If you ever get to work with her, you are being blessed. So,
Yes.
we are super excited for this topic of the impact of intergenerational trauma. Dun dun dun. And we are just so honored that Rakhi joined us for this episode and is going to share some great wisdom. So buckle up, stay tuned because we're about to dive into this. Also, I feel like we should put a disclaimer because this can be one of those topics that gets a little intense and,
Hmm.
gets the
Yeah.
feels of working. So, if at any point while you're listening to this that you need to take a pause or it feels overwhelming, we encourage you to do that. Do not try to listen to this whole thing at once if it feels like too much. And also to just check in with yourself and take care of yourself as you are listening to this. So,
Yes.
with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ash, to get us started here.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to insert and start with some general definitions of trauma, just to dip our toes into this topic and just give an understanding of what trauma is, um, so that it'll help us better understand intergenerational trauma. So, the American Psychological Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, a crime, a natural disaster, physical or emotional abuse, neglect, experiencing or witnessing violence, death of a loved one, war, and many more other moments,
Anymore.
events. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a intergenerational trauma definition um, that I found here, but it's important to keep in mind we're going to talk way more about that in the
Mm-hmm.
context of everything. So, the definition I have here is the transmission of trauma or its legacy in the form of a psychological consequence of an injury or attack, poverty, and so forth from the generation experiencing the trauma to subsequent generations. This specific type of trauma often happens as a result of direct personal experiences, like witnessing acts of violence or residing in environments where the threat of violence is ever present. Such trauma can manifest in various ways, like anxiety, depression, PTSD. Some other words that have been used for intergenerational trauma are historical trauma, multi-generational trauma, or secondary traumatization. Um, Generational trauma can be passed down through DNA from family member to family member. Some people may be predispositioned to it, but it's important to remember that not everyone who experiences intergenerational trauma has symptoms related to their experience. It's a complex trauma, and there are many factors at play regarding this inherited trauma, including resilience, support systems, and resource access. When I was looking into these definitions and just reflecting on them professionally, it reminded me of when baby girls are in the womb, and by the time they're born, they already have all of their eggs, like
Mm.
for their lifetime. And I'm like, that it's kind of reminding me of is the generational trauma in the DNA as well? Like we predisposition to being startled or these types of sounds or lights or things like that. But that was just my brain like going and wandering.
That's a valid point. Like, I think the when you were reading that, the thing that stuck out to me the most, and I don't know why, is like psychological consequence. And I'm like, oh, that just
Yeah.
feels like, I don't know, it just like gets under your skin. It's just like a ew word, right? And it's not even like that intense of a word, but it's just like together, it's like it's a lot. I don't know. I had a very
Mm-hmm.
visceral reaction when you were saying that, but
Mm-hmm.
it's ooh, it's weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
But Rocky, go ahead.
if I may jump into that point, Erin, it makes me think about, how much the womb affects the baby that's in it, right? Like I know of children who are born, let's say, addicted to drugs because it was in the maternal system, right? And those consequences obviously live in the child, well, potentially live in the child after they're born, even though they didn't personally do anything,
Right. Yeah.
but they
Exactly.
but they live with the effects of that. Now that's a physiological, biological thing, but I guess the metaphor is that could that also be happening psychologically?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. That's where my brain was like going of like, are these other things like planted
Mm-hmm.
within us at birth, like that psychological consequence, like automatically feeling like I'm not enough or like I'm gonna get in trouble for this one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh man.
I mean, I have to think that maybe it's not that specific. Maybe that line, like, I'm not enough. Maybe not that line, but the predisposition to be anxious, which then
Yes.
is the form of that thought,
Yes.
is maybe what how I would think of it. Like
Yeah.
that, there's folk wisdom. We say that mothers should be happy when they're pregnant because
Right.
it's better for the child. I mean, this is just folk wisdom. This is not something, I guess, medically, I don't know if they say that or not, but folk wisdom is, oh, if you're pregnant, make sure you're not stressed, make sure you're happy, make sure you're in as good a, I guess nutritionally and psychologically you're in as good a state as possible, because that is apparently better for the child, right? And so again, that speaks to the idea that the influences at that stage have an impact and then can therefore carry over into the actual life after being born.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That is so interesting, and this is like such a interjection that I don't know if it like fits, but it made me think about like my mom like swears that when you're pregnant, whoever you have like maybe like conflict with, or like maybe you just like aren't really like vibing with, is who your baby will come out like personality matching. And she swears that. She said that when she was pregnant with me, her older sister and her, like, she just annoyed her so bad when she was pregnant. And I literally am like exact copy of that. Like emotionally, like we're very like in our feelings. We like it's like we're very sensitive. We cry a lot. And then my mom with my brother, like, was not vibing with my dad's brother. And my brother is like the spitting image of him, like repeating same trends. It's so crazy. And so it made me think about that, like, like that psychological thing too, of like, if
Mm,
you're, like my mom being pregnant, of like being annoyed or like feeling some type of way, like how, just like how the impact of that is just, I don't know. I feel like it's like mind blowing, and it also makes me have like a baby existential crisis a little bit. So it's like I'm gonna rein that in, but it's so interesting on just
the mechanism that I have come across, again, I'm not a medical professional, so I couldn't tell you the exact, um, validity of this idea. But what I have come across is that basically when you have reactions to stress, to anxiety, to difficult situations, and that could not be a specific person, it could be stressful circumstances like poverty or being in a war or whatever like that. So if you're having as a human being, the mother who's pregnant is having those is in those experiences, then obviously she's producing stress hormones, she's producing, she's having the bodily reactions to the stressful situation. And we know that those kinds of, they cross they move into the placenta, the baby is going to get some of that as well. So that may be part of the predisposition to be affected by stress, because the stress hormones and that kind of an environment has affected the baby, even when the baby personally wasn't
Mm-hmm.
interacting with these circumstances.
Oh,
Yeah. It's a wild time.
it is a wild time.
But that
Oh,
is so insightful and so like helpful in
Yeah.
understanding like what we are like coming into in the world and what we're facing.
then it makes it feel like multifaceted, right? Of like, okay, like there's a big part of this that I just took on, right? From like my parents or whoever, right? Without even like having a choice or a say in it, right? And then there's like
Mhm.
a part of it that's like, is it like almost I feel okay, like that makes me feel like a little relief that it wasn't just like I was just like developed this, right? Like this was passed on, this was something I learned kind of thing. But then there's another side of it that's like, okay, but then if it was like just passed down to me, like and I inherited it, then like can I have like control over it, right? Can I change it? Like how set in stone is that? And so I could see that being like depending on, the person that's thinking
Mhm.
about it to have very mixed feelings around it, right? Of like, oh, gross, like I didn't get a say in this, and also like am I going to be able to change
Mhm.
it, right? Which I think is a good
Yeah,
segue into our conversation. And I know, Rakhi, for
definitely.
you, like you when we were talking about like different definitions for trauma, like you kind of shared that you have your own that you kind of go off of, so I would love to hear it.
Yeah, so the way I look at trauma, a lot of it comes obviously from things I've read and the scholarly work, but a lot of it comes just from my clinical experience. And what I've come to understand is that trauma is, of course, we often think of trauma as being inherent in what happens in the event, right? You've given examples of war or poverty or violence or things like that, and so we can see, oh yeah, if I was in Hurricane Katrina, I imagine that I was traumatized, because that was a very clearly, the event would have been traumatic by any definition. um, Equally, I think for people, sometimes it's not the event itself, it's the experience of the event that defines the level of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So what may be traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me, and vice versa, right? You might think, okay, come on, get over this, no big deal. For me, that might be then feel like the end of the world, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. So what I mean by that is that it's sometimes when I see students or when I work with people who are showing signs of trauma, they may not have in their history something that says, oh, this particular event happened, therefore I feel this way. But when I look, it could be something like, I don't know, in sixth grade, my teacher made this comment and I have never gotten over that. So
Mm-hmm.
it can look very minor, it can seem very small or simple, but somehow the impact of that particular event is where the trauma came from,
Mm. Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so if I can kind of take this a little further, the way I look at trauma in general is to think of it in terms of big T trauma and little t trauma. So big T, as in trauma with a capital T, is where the events are objectively and defined as being traumatic, something very significant. I was sexually assaulted. I went through this, natural disaster, or I was in a car accident. So those are objectively big deal situations, and therefore I would call them big T traumas. Equally, there can be a lot of small things which by themselves may not even look like anything significant, but when you add them up cumulatively, they have the same impact or similar impact as any big T trauma, right? So again, a comment from a teacher, maybe one comment may not make a big difference to any given person, but a comment made over and over and over again, a similar comment,
Right.
that can add up and create the same impact as if you were in a bigger um, traumatic experience. So things like, sometimes we talk about bullying, for example, like, oh, don't mind, or it was just the one time, or they just do things, no big deal. But it can get very invasive and pervasive as it accumulates over time.
Right.
Sometimes in our family homes, you mentioned the concept of neglect. Neglect is a really tricky one when it comes to thinking about trauma, because neglect is the absence of something more than it is the presence of something,
Yeah.
right? So it is harder to identify neglect in many cases, because we talk about, I had everything, I don't even know why I'm reacting like this. But what you're reacting to is something that wasn't there,
Right.
Mm.
which could
Yeah.
be attention, which could be care, which could be, I had all the food, but I didn't have nutritional food,
Mm-hmm.
So you're reacting to the absence of something. And in the world of trauma, why that's important is because that it's the little d traumas that are easier to invalidate
Mhm.
and overlook and ignore.
Whoa.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That was powerful. I'm curious what your thoughts are about like what we were talking about earlier and its
Mhm.
connection to the little t traumas of like what we're predispositioned to or
Mhm.
what was in our DNA and how it is
Yeah,
connected to a little t.
that's a great question. And the answer is, the way I'm looking at the answer, I would think of it as, maybe some of those influences in the womb or whatever, maybe they were little t traumas in themselves, for one example, but also they might set us up to be more predisposed to respond to certain things in as a trauma, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the word resilience has been mentioned earlier, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it impacts our resilience, right? So that the same comment to me has a certain impact because my resilience is lower, or uh my defenses are kind of down because I've already, I'm carrying the stress response from my in utero history, versus somebody else might say that's not a big deal, I don't know why it matters to you so much, right? Because they feel stronger, they have more resources,
Mm-hmm.
so they're not harmed as much. A metaphorical way to describe this for me is that, let's say the person who has this in their womb, they were exposed to these things. Let's say they're born with a smaller bank account, whereas somebody who had a better nutrition, better emotional, in the mother was more, had better nutrition, had better emotional and psychological resources, maybe they're kind of born with a greater bank account, right? So the same thing happens. You experience an event that requires a withdrawal of, I don't know, let's just say $50, and you were born with a $50 bank account, which means you're at zero, right? Whereas if somebody is born with $1,000 bank account, well, okay, it took something out of them, but they still have 950 in their account, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they have the tools of how to
Yes,
store and add to their bank account.
yes.
I'm so
I
glad you brought that up because
yes.
as you were going through that, talking about like big T, little t, like
Mhm,
I literally could hear clients that I've had be like, well,
mhm,
like there's no reason for me to like feel this way because like my parents like provided for me, right? Like
mhm,
they gave me a good life, like all the things. And it's like I love the way you worded it of like it's not about what was there, it was the lack of,
mhm,
right? Like, and so I really hope that, our listeners can hear this and for the people who need it to be validated, right?
mhm,
Rather than being furtherly dismissed or like continuing their own dismissal of their feelings and things
mhm,
because it's not about like you went through these really intense like on the news story like
mhm,
traumatic things, right? Like they can be like everyday situations
Mhm.
that impact you and traumatize you, essentially. So I'm
Mhm.
really glad you brought that up because I think that there are a lot of people and students, especially, that could benefit from hearing that. Um,
Mhm.
and so maybe that's a part for our listeners to like highlight and like keep in mind, write it down in your journals.
Well, and I think if I may extrapolate further, when I think about, we are talking about generational trauma, and generational can obviously be what is experienced in the family, but also generational can be societal, it can be cultural, right?
Mm,
So,
yeah.
one of the ways in which I also connect that with little t traumas is because if a certain type of attitude or stereotype is associated with a certain group, then that also, again, on the face of it, everybody's fine. They have a certain amount of, maybe financial security, maybe they're doing well, they have education, but they're also constantly being um, the subject or the target of certain attitudes, right? Now, again, one instance of a certain attitude, you don't get called to speak up in class, no big deal. But if you're never called to speak up in class,
Mm,
Mhm.
then you learn to think about yourself in a certain way, right?
exactly.
And or um, so those kinds of attitudes, those kinds of treatments, how we treat people, can also cumulatively affect us down the generations.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about, things like microaggressions, racial trauma, like I can link those kinds of things to what we're talking about as well.
Oh, right. Yeah. 1000%.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is such like, as you were pulling that into the conversation, it's like it feels like even just like a missing piece of how much trauma and just like things that were said and heard and behaviors, that were done. Like, and of course, like the first thing that comes to mind, like I'm thinking of just like our African American like
Mhm.
population, right? Which is very much still like you will hear even in like current generations, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Of like it's still holding, right? Like it's
Hmm.
still holding like the trauma of it, which
Mhm.
we get why, right? But I think
Mhm.
it's so fascinating because as I think about that, like I think of um people that have been in my life, like especially like white people in my
Mhm.
life who are like, well, slavery hasn't happened for, hundreds like years. Like
Mhm.
it's not a thing. So like the new generations, younger people don't have any right to feel.
Mhm.
And it's like first off, how as a
Hmm.
white person do you feel privileged to say that? But
Hmm.
second off, I think that just shows like the lack of knowledge and naivety around the impact of generational trauma, especially something as like horrific as intense as slavery was, right? And I mean,
Mhm.
we could say that for like the annihilation of like Native Americans, right? Like so there's just like so many things to it, but it
Mhm.
just like kind of going back to um being dismissed, right? But also like still how the
Mhm.
impact of that is still carried and seeped
Yeah.
into, right? And even so of like, and I hear a lot of times of like my African American clients, friends, like people in my life who, even if they haven't had like a, specific event where someone said something, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
It's still like you can tell it's like holding this like anxiety, this fear, this
Mhm.
hurt, this sadness of
Mhm.
what has happened
Yeah.
in their ancestors and in generations before. And I think like that's such a powerful thing to think about, right? And like maybe even like a core example to refer to if you're struggling to understand generational trauma of you can literally see that that's still ever present and that's
Mhm.
been carried down.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me that there's people that kind of refuse to acknowledge that and are so easy to dismiss it. And also, I think that might speak to a lot of privilege in being able to do that.
Yeah. And again, we know that not everybody has the same response to the same thing because
Right.
we are born with our psychological bank accounts, whatever those may be, So I think when you have a certain, whatever your reality is, your reality, it's hard to imagine a reality that isn't yours, and that's true for all of us, obviously. I
Yeah.
just think as psychologists or as therapists, we learn very intentionally to understand realities that are not our own, but most people don't have to, are not asked to, and may
Mhm.
choose not to. And so we don't look beyond what is natural and normal and obvious to us. Whereas, you know, but that's really a question, that's really a comment on my psychological bank account, right? That this is what I have. And because I have it, I just assume everybody has it.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
And that counts both for people who have privilege and for people who don't, because people who don't have certain privileges might see that that is the whole world. And to them, the idea of certain kinds of privilege might be as alien as the idea of privilege, I mean, as non having privilege is to people who have privilege. So our normals are sometimes so defined by our experiences and sometimes not even our own experiences that we live them without fully understanding what we're living.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I totally feel that. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to pivot
Hmm.
because as we're getting into this big T, little T trauma, can you maybe, Rakhi, kind of define or just talk about like what does generational trauma feel like
Mm-hmm.
for, our listeners who might not really be aware of that?
Great question. And I would just say that generational trauma to me is trauma.
Mhm.
And the impact of generational trauma looks, as far as I can tell, just like any kind of trauma response. Only when it's generational, we may not understand its causes as well because they may not be as obviously apparent.
Mhm.
And we can get to that in a minute. But in terms of what our responses might look like, um, trauma is generally a situation where a person feels that their coping resources are overwhelmed. They're they don't have control over what's going on because of their coping resources being overwhelmed. So they feel out of control. Um, they feel unsafe. That is a core aspect of trauma, is the not feeling safe. And I think, and this is variable, but what we can do about it, you know, the sense of agency is limited or compromised.
Right.
So, what does that look like? Those factors mean somebody who was traumatized can be pretty anxious all the time because they don't know what's coming. They don't know if I can deal with it, what's going to feel like. I don't feel safe. So there's a constant sense of anxiety about what could go wrong. We could talk about hypervigilance because there's a constant scanning and trying to be aware of what danger might be coming at you. And this may be so normal that we don't even recognize that we're doing it. But a quick example, I think, is about how women are trained to always be aware of their surroundings, because of the sense
Oh,
of
yeah.
risk, which I think most men, again, being
Mm-hmm.
mindful, most men don't ever have to, right?
Right. Right.
So just that awareness, and it may feel so normal to a woman that they're scanning and kind of keeping an eye out for who's around or not. It may not feel like anything new or unusual, but it just becomes normal. But that's something they're doing, which maybe another person is not, for
Right.
Yeah.
example. So the anxiety, which can kind of morph into a certain level of hypervigilance, is a common way of trauma expressing itself. It can also feel like depression, because if I feel like I don't, my resources have been overwhelmed and my sense of agency is really compromised, then it can feel like, well, I can't do anything about this. I just feel like I'm stuck and I don't have anything to do about it. So then that can become this, a dissociative. You just want to escape or you want to get away from it. So you can feel, so depression can be a big part of it.
Mhm.
We often talk about um, a, a tendency to avoid, things that have a traumatic influence, but understandable. I mean, who wants to move towards something that feels painful? So
Right.
avoidance can be a big way, can be a big factor in how we approach or respond to trauma, and where that can be, well, in the short term, that's helpful because you're trying to avoid something that is dangerous or potentially painful. But in the long term, what it can do is it can become a pervasive way of approaching or living your life. So you're avoiding things that may or may not need to be avoided, but because you're anxious that they might be difficult, you're going to just stay away from it. So then that can become a limitation rather than just coping.
Yeah.
So those are some of the main things. And I think there may also be a tendency to want to numb out because trauma is unpleasant. Feelings related to trauma are unpleasant. So there's a way in which I think and humans tend to be pleasure seeking. So we don't really invite ourselves to feel in pain. So we want to numb out because that may be preferable to feeling something negative. And the numbing out can look all kinds of different ways. Some of the more obvious ways can be things like addictions. I think about addictions as a way to feel better, even if you're not getting better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a quick fix,
Yeah.
So addictions, even something like eating disorders, again, that's kind of a big one, but eating disorders can serve that function because you're focused so much. And eating disorders are very complex, but they have a physiological piece, and then of course they have the emotional psychological piece because it's a way to be in control of something.
Yes.
Right? So, I mean, and that's a separate topic to be investigated, but in the
Mm-hmm.
context of thinking about trauma, it can be seen as a coping strategy
Mm-hmm.
um, to try and be in control or numb out as well. And then I think those were the two main ones. But we numb out in other ways too. We can dissociate. Sometimes we have dissociative responses. We zone out, or we check out, or we isolate. So those are some other things we do. And depending on where we think our danger is coming from, we may isolate from people, right? We are not just isolating from a certain, like just all people can start to feel dangerous at some level. So
Yeah.
then that can look like social anxiety on the surface, but it can also really mean it's a trauma response where people are dangerous because they're harmful. The assumption is that people are dangerous and harmful, so we need to get away
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would
That's
you describe like anger or like struggling with expression of anger as also how it could feel like? How
from.
trauma
Very
can
much
feel
so.
like?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I would put it into the larger piece of emotional regulation,
Okay.
is one of the things that happens in little t, especially in little t traumas,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is that the experience is invalidated, right? Again, like I was saying, with neglect or emotional abuse, or sometimes even physical or sexual abuse for that matter. Um, part of what makes it abusive is this idea that it's not, we're going to pretend that it's not as bad,
yeah.
Whoa.
right?
Yeah.
So it's cloaked up to be something that it isn't. And
Mm.
that's the way to hide or deny the abuse itself, but it's happening, the trauma is happening, but the person that it's happening to is not
Mm-hmm.
allowed to acknowledge it or to really feel it. So the invalidation is a really, so the experience is the experience of the trauma, and then to me the invalidation of that experience kind of seals it in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when that happens, there's a component of trauma in this kind of trauma where the person may lose their ability or their confidence in being able to trust their own experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Whoa.
I'm feeling this thing, but I'm being told it's not a big deal,
Right. Yeah.
Whoa. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't like this person touching me this way, but I'm being told it's normal and I shouldn't be disrespectful to such and such person.
Right.
So what do I believe? Do I believe what I'm feeling, what my body is telling me, what my mind is telling me, or do I believe what I'm being told to believe?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm.
right, so it can create a real distrust in experience or a lack of confidence. Like, can I trust myself? Am I really making the right conclusion? So when you're in that kind of chaos, I'm going to call it chaos, right? There
Yeah.
can be a sense of internal chaos. And from that perspective, it's hard to know what emotions are real, what my emotions are, what I want to do with my emotions.
Right.
Mm.
Because a part of me may be very legitimately angry, upset, sad about whatever is happening, but I'm
Hmm.
being told, no, 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 none of that's important. Look happy, be happy, calm down. You're overreacting. So what do I do with all these emotions, right?
Hmm.
So it's hard to regulate. If I know I'm angry and then I'm angry and then I'm done being angry, it's over, right? But when I have these experiences and emotions for which I have no clear outlet, for which I can't quite be sure what the reasons are, and I'm just saying this is all a messy, I mean, therefore, is another reason to numb out. But also, they might be very irregular and erratic, right? So I'm reasonably angry with somebody, but I'm not supposed to be angry at that person, or I'm not allowed to be angry with that person.
Right.
It might come out sideways and I get angry about something that's relatively inconsequential.
Right. Right.
And then I'm being told, what's wrong with you? You have an anger problem. And then I'm thinking, oh, here's another thing that I'm not doing well with. So now what do I do with this anger? And why am I being angry at, the server in the restaurant when they really didn't do anything? So what's wrong with me? So then I get even more confused and I get even less trustful of my own experiences. So it can be a bit of a vicious cycle. So
Wow.
not knowing what to do with our emotions can also be actually a part of the trauma response, or the impact of trauma.
Okay.
And so whether that's anger or sadness or just about any other emotion, we don't even know when to feel happy, to be honest. Like, can I feel happy? Am I supposed to feel happy at this or not? So
Right.
everything can feel confusing if we get to that point, right?
Hmm.
So then not being able to regulate emotions, or not knowing how to regulate our emotions, can come out in all these different ways.
Mm.
Yeah, just snowballs.
Yeah.
Oof, yeah. But I mean, I think that like makes me think of there's a lot of times that, working with our students here where there's like this lack of being able to identify emotions, but also like a mistrust in like their own decision making, or like,
Mhm.
is this like actually like what I'm feeling or like what I want to do? And it's like, oh, right? Like
Mhm.
maybe that's like a piece too to also keep in mind of that lack of feeling that, right? Like how much were you dismissed, right? Like in terms of things like this. So it's a very interesting point that I'm going to keep in mind.
Yeah.
But I also want to kind of think about too of how would you describe the process of uncovering like
Mhm.
generational trauma?
Yeah. I think this is an interesting and a tricky one, because when we look at generational trauma, we're talking about events or circumstances that took place outside of, well, not necessarily, but potentially outside of the awareness of the person who's experiencing, right? So again, one version of generational trauma is stuff that our parents maybe went through, and as a result, they treat us in a certain way, or our community went through and the community treats us in a certain way, and we don't label it as such, like, let's just say, um, my father grew up in poverty, or he, uh, this is a slightly complicated political situation, but the country got divided, so our family lost whatever property or roots they had, and so they were migrants essentially within their own country, but they were a migrant because the country was divided. So then they lost their literal bank account, and their psychological bank account also took a big hit, right? So my father's whole thing was, I need to not be poor, and his approach to it was through education. I'm gonna go into education. The rest of my family, or others in his generation, are not as educated as my father was, but for him, that was his way out of poverty, right? I didn't experience any of that, but I know the emphasis he placed on education,
Right.
And that I received very directly.
Mhm.
And even though we disagreed on many, many other things, when I chose to educate myself, he was there for me,
Mhm.
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So even though I personally didn't start out thinking education is important to me, but I learned that and I got that very strongly from his history, right? Now, I know this part of his history, so I can point out and say, here's why I have been so conditioned to appreciate education.
Right.
Now, if this had been a couple generations ago and I didn't know about that or I didn't have this information, I might still walk around thinking education is really important, but I wouldn't necessarily have a clear cut understanding of why I think that's important.
Mhm.
Right.
So for other things, for more traumatic things, the same thing can happen, right? So something may be very important in a community or in a family, but we may be playing out the impact of it without fully understanding where it's coming from. Now, if we have the luxury and the capacity to find out, that would be amazing, because just understanding a problem can be so valuable in helping manage it.
Mhm.
Right?
Correct.
Because sometimes so much of it is the invalidation we do or we receive. Like, I don't understand why you're doing this. You have no reason to. There's no point. Or I'm blowing this out of proportion. I have no business being this upset about, because there's nothing to be upset about, right? So in the generational context, not knowing where it came from can lead to an invalidating dynamic
Yeah.
internally, but also from other people. Like we say, what you just described with for the African American population going, what are you so upset about? Slavery hasn't been around for a while. Well, no, it hasn't. And yet I'm this upset. What's wrong with me? Or, we get that invalidation both internally and outside.
Right.
But
Right. Right.
if we understand and say, here's the breadcrumbs, here's how it all links up, and this is why I feel this way, then even that validation can be really important, right?
Yes.
So to find out is great, but we don't always have that option. So just
Right.
knowing, and as a clinician, I approach it from the perspective, even if we don't know why, there is a why, and I'm just going to assume there's a why, so that's why this is happening.
Right. Yeah.
But the point is that if we're going to look for intergenerational trauma, understanding the history of the person, understanding the larger family history of that person to whatever degree is possible, is really helpful, right?
Mm.
Because a lot of times we talk about therapy in terms of, what are your irrational thoughts, or how can we change the way we think um, to feel a different way. And that's a very valid approach. But sometimes it's also really helpful to understand why we think the way we think at all
Yeah.
before we figure out what needs changing, and also more importantly, what direction do we want it to change in.
True.
Right? So we can do a very here and now kind of therapy where the past kind of doesn't matter and you're just looking at what is and how can we make it different. But for intergenerational thing, what it does is that it gives us a way to validate our own experience, and understanding the historical factors that might have led to it um, gives us a foundation from where to understand and address what is happening in the present.
Mhm.
So we ask questions like, what happened in your family? What were your parents like? What was your relationship with your parents? How did they treat you? How did you treat them? And when relevant and if relevant, we can also start, okay, so this is your parents. What do you know about your grandparents? What do you know about your community history? Um, Now, and the further back we go, it can start to feel or look more and more fanciful,
Mm.
because
Mm.
it's not as fact-based, right? Whereas at that point, we're somewhat speculating
Right.
that, oh, this happened, X hundred years ago, and can I still probably be affected by that? I'm not making a statement or an assertion on that, but I'm at least being open to the possibility that
Right.
there is a legacy that is now being played out in this particular way.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Ugh. I
My
mean,
mind is being blown right now.
I know I'm like just thinking about all the layers of it.
Hmm
And also, like, I just keep coming back to just how impactful, even without people, like, I think knowing that they're doing this, of how impactful
Mhm.
dismissiveness and invalidation is, even when they can have really great intentions, right? Of like, from their perspective of trying to like help the person move on, right? But like, man, it is so like intertwined in it so much. And I don't think I thought about it of like even just thinking about generationally being dismissed, right? Like if
Mhm.
your grandma had feelings or felt some type of way, but they were told like, no, you're fine, get over it, then like if their child feels that same way and then they pass down that narrative of like, well, I was told I was fine, get over it, so that's what I'm gonna tell you, like
Hmm.
it just keeps going. Okay.
Another version I've heard of that is parents or grandparents saying, I had it this way. So be
Mhm.
grateful that you don't have it this way.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's another way of like dismissing that
Mhm.
child's or
Mhm.
person's like struggle or what they're going through. Like, okay, yeah, it wasn't that bad,
Mhm.
right? But I'm
Yeah.
still feeling bad and neglected and dismissed.
Right.
Right. Ugh, yes. I cannot.
Gross.
I cannot. Well, and
Well,
it's, oh, sorry, Ricky, you
no,
go.
no, no. Go ahead.
I was just gonna make the comment, like, then it's like, okay, why is this the one is why is this the comparison game, right? Like, why is that
Hmm.
being used to manipulate me, right? But then also too, it's like a lot of times I've like in my experience of hearing that of when it's being used, it's usually when someone's calling them out, right,
Mm.
for their parenting or lack of, or just like maybe their not okay behavior. And then it's
Mhm.
like, well, you should be grateful because like I put a roof over your head. And it's like, first off, like, did you decide to have a child and be responsible for a life? Like, come now. But that's a whole other topic. But it just like, it's I don't know.
But even there, I can and am responsible. I mean, am grateful that you put a roof over my head. I'm not saying I'm not grateful for that. I'm reacting to something different.
Right. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's the thing
Yes.
that may not what is, but what isn't, right? The roof over my head is there, and I am grateful for it. But what I'm saying is, I also have a certain feeling that you can't understand or respond or acknowledge. And that's what I'm asking you for, which is entirely different.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
And you're just what you just said, Erin, also made me think of the movie Encanto. To me, it is the depiction of intergenerational trauma and all the different ways it plays out. You have the immigrant, grandmother, I think, who faced whatever she faced when she changed and moved to this new place. But then she's asked her children and the grandchildren to be a certain way about in their own lives. And
Hmm.
each of them has their own so-called superpower. You have the strong and you have the volatile and you have the like each of them has their own characteristic. And so interestingly, you have the character nobody speaks about. We don't talk about Bruno.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that's the secret, and yet that still has an impact on everybody, even though we never talk about Bruno.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, man. Now I want to go rewatch that movie.
Me too.
Oh, gosh. Well, now I'm
Mm.
gonna have the song stuck in my head, so thank you, Rakhi. But also, too, listeners, like, yes, we are talking about a lot of different things, and some of this might be triggering and just make you like have a lot of reflections and thoughts right now, right?
Mhm.
But also, there is a way to have hope, right? There is a way to have healing through trauma. Like, yes, we can acknowledge, right, of like, I can see where this generationally, right, has been passed down. But I think there's also a part of now, right? Like you're listening to our podcast, you're hearing Rakhi talk about like wonderful information that's good to know. And so now the ball's kind of in your court, right? Of like, what do you do with this information now, right? Like, do you choose to stick in that pattern, right? And potentially repeat it, right? Or do you choose to do something about it, right? And like develop more awareness around just even like intergenerational trauma or the behaviors and impact from that, right? Like, so wanting to kind of also give you some just like ways to kind of build up that healing process. And so the first one is definitely identifying and acknowledging, right, the impact and the effects of past traumas, not only like in your life, right, but just like generationally, right? Like what's been going on. And this really has to be done with acceptance and a huge amount of kindness and self-compassion, right? Like this doesn't need to be something where you're coming at it and trying to beat yourself up even more so or being really negative. Like we have to be able to approach this with a mindset of just like having empathy and compassion for ourselves and what we've been through and even like generationally, right? Like what family members might have gone through, right? And so talking about your experience like with someone that maybe you trust or maybe you like in therapy or whoever it may be, right? Like this can be really powerful. Almost like I think of it of like being able to use your voice, right? And call out, right? Of what it is that has impacted you and the trauma and the effects of things. So that's the first thing, right? But also educating yourself about family history. Learn what happened in previous generations, right? Like, were there like situations? Were there big traumatic, like natural disasters, right? Like, did you have families that like were split up for whatever reasons, right? Like, there can be so many things we can fill in the blank with that, right? But get to know of what went on, right, in your family history and lineage, because this will help you to make sense of your experiences. And I think like tying it back to like what you were saying earlier, Rakhi, of even just like maybe this like innate anxiety, right? Or feelings of like, I don't even know like what might be making me anxious, right? But like if I sit and think about it and really like pull from where this kind of is going, right? Like that can give us just this validation of like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right?
Mhm.
And I think practicing self-care is going to be really important. Like
Yes.
as we said at the beginning of this can be a topic that's super intense and triggering and causes a lot of emotions and thoughts and things. And so in this process, you might uncover some things that are not pleasant, right? Like it might be things that like are really hard to hear or to hold, right? And also to revisiting traumas that you might have experienced can be really hard to hold. And like you said earlier, Rakhi, like as humans, we don't really like to lean into the uncomfortable. So make sure that you are practicing self-care, that you're taking care of yourself. This is not just like the cliche things of like taking a bubble bath, right? Like these are being able to check on all of your self-care cups, right? Like our physical, our mental, our spiritual, all the things, right? Like, am I giving myself space to get my emotions down and process and just give them space, right? Am I like moving my body? Am I reaching out to my support people? So just making sure that we are taking care of ourselves as this can be a really like intense like process.
Yes. Another thing we can do is like kind of what you mentioned earlier, Erin, is connecting with others who've
Mhm.
shared similar experiences, whether that be your family members, or other support groups of like the specific traumas you've gone through.
Mhm.
Um, what was sticking out to me from what you said earlier, Rocky, in the mistrust piece in terms of healing how would one start to begin to learn ways
Mhm,
of trusting themselves
mhm,
with their emotions
mhm.
when, let's say, they don't have access to the person that was a part of that
Yeah.
damage or
Mhm,
wound in the first place?
mhm. Oh, such an important question because I think instinctively we want to go back. And if we don't even know where we're going back to, that's a whole other can of worms. But
Oh, yeah.
typically wanting to go back to where we think or know the harm happened, and like you have to change yourself and
Hmm.
give me the validation or acknowledge or say sorry or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
um, and I think the key here is that um, in therapy we call it the corrective emotional experience. It doesn't have to happen in the therapy setting necessarily, but it's something we recognize. But it can happen other places, so that a certain emotional experience got you to this place of not trusting, right? So ideally, you would have a corrective emotional experience where you have a different set of interactions, which allows you to learn how to trust. So, now so the paradox here is you have to start with somebody you can trust who will then teach you to trust yourself, right? Which
Yeah.
is paradoxical. And
Yeah.
in that sense, we might at least say, well, I mean, a therapist is supposed to be trustworthy, so I will. But even there, I am very much an advocate of saying, work with somebody who is a good fit for you.
Hmm.
you know who do you feel safe with, who do you feel comfortable with? And whether that's a therapist or a non-therapist, start by asking yourself, where do I feel comfortable, who do I feel safe with? And that's is asking you to trust your own experience to start with.
Wow. Yeah, that is so true.
But you do know that these I am more comfortable with this person than that person, even if you don't understand why. There is that knowing, and that is a part of your experience. You start by trusting,
Mm.
and then you go from there. But what the big picture is, you're looking to have the corrective emotional experience as much as possible, but it can be a two-part thing. One is, how much of it can you give yourself,
Hmm.
right? And that a big part of that is self-compassion, by not dismissing yourself, by not doubting or invalidating yourself,
Yeah.
and having compassion. Okay, for whatever reason, I have these really difficult, inconvenient, painful things that I have, even if I don't understand why I have them. I don't like them, I don't have to agree with them or anything, but I have them. And that's a self-compassionate approach to validating your own experience. And
Mm.
so you start with that, you give yourself some of the things you didn't get, and you also seek, hopefully, an interpersonal experience, even if it's not with the person where it originally happened, but you also seek the interpersonal experience from where you can get what you didn't get initially. And that can be accurate mirroring, that can be validation, that can be actual support, care, comfort, whatever it is, right?
Right.
And
Mm.
sometimes it can also happen out of impersonal, like sometimes you listen to a song and it gets you right where you need to go.
Yeah.
Like, how did this person know me? Like, everything in the song is what's going on. And that's a kind of validation that doesn't have to come from another physical person, you know,
Right. Yeah.
in front
Yes.
of you, but it can serve that purpose, at least to some degree.
Yeah.
Song, a movie, you watch Encanto, and maybe you have an experience of, like, go through some of the things we're talking about. So popular culture is also really valid and important in many ways, right?
Hmm.
Um, but finding that corrective emotional experience where you can then, receive what might have been missed, and then you can then internalize it. Because essentially, the pain of what we are walking around with is the pain of internalizing some very difficult negative things. We carry that inside. So we need to replace what's inside with the things that are actually going to nurture and support and help us grow.
Oh, that sounds so painful because I feel that. But that was so beautifully said,
It was
honestly.
very
Hmm.
beautiful.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes. And I like the emphasis on, because I think we get asked this a lot, or at least I do, of like, well, this person or this situation, right, happened, and I don't speak to that person again, nor do I want to. And it's like, okay, it doesn't have to be about like you necessarily having a conversation where that person holds themselves accountable, takes responsibility, apologizes, whatever, right? But it's like that internal process of like, I can give myself what I needed and deserved in that moment, right? Whether it's with people that feel supportive, right? Or validating and giving that to myself. And I think that's something that isn't talked about enough. And so I'm glad that you brought that up as like a part of the healing process that can be very impactful, right? Of like,
Mm-hmm.
how do I show up and validate myself in this and acknowledge like the impact and the hurt or whatever without ever needing someone else to necessarily do that.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
I mean, wouldn't it be absolutely perfect and ideal if the person who did this would somehow just,
right.
I mean, it happens. I'm not saying it never happens, but it could happen. And if that happens, it's golden, perfect, you
Right.
know?
Okay.
Yeah.
Reality being, it may not happen and it may not happen on your timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Right.
So it's not about whether it could or should happen, but it may happen and it may not happen on your timeline. So it doesn't, so we can still do certain things for ourselves. And I personally believe that what happens interpersonally also heals interpersonally,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's not all or none. It doesn't mean that it can only heal interpersonally, but it also heals interpersonally.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I think if people were, I don't know, just saying mean to us, it matters that we be around people who are kind to us.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Because we don't want to carry only the meanness around. We do want to carry the kindness around.
No.
We can be kind to ourselves, no question, but there's something about receiving it from another person that is a different but also important thing, and it doesn't replace one doesn't replace the other, but they kind of work together, in my opinion.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That's a good point.
That is so true. And a great way of starting that process is seeking a mental health professional, going to therapy. I often remind my clients or new clients when they come in of like, I don't really know what to talk about today, or like, I don't know where to start, or just something doesn't feel right. Often reminding them that just bringing themselves here,
Mhm,
or even after like we've processed something heavy, of
mhm,
like, you did this, like,
mhm,
you allowed yourself to let all that out and like have it
mhm,
here, have it in a conversation. Like
mhm,
you allowed yourself to witness it
mhm,
and another person. So like
mhm.
starting there is oftentimes like that start of building your own trust back
Yeah.
and that confidence.
And I always tell my clients or people who talk to me about being interested in therapy, like if you've listened to this, conversation and you've looked at all these pieces we've talked about, and in your mind you're going, I think the word trauma kind of fits for me. It
Mm.
may or it may not, but if you're asking and saying to yourself, I think the word trauma kind of fits for me, then I would recommend you look for a therapist if that's what you're going to do. Look for a therapist who practices from a trauma informed perspective. At that point, their actual theoretical orientation may be less important. I mean, it's not zero important, but it may be less important. But make sure that this is a person who can speak to trauma.
Right.
Yes.
And it's a question you can ask, do you have a trauma informed perspective, or how do you see your trauma informed perspective? What would that look like?
Hmm.
um, and to also then check in with yourself. Does this person's response reassure me? Does it feel comforting? Is it, this is again wanting that, like, you are allowed to advocate for yourself,
Yes.
and you're allowed to discern and trust that this is what's going to be a good fit for me, because I do think fit with a therapist is truly important.
Of course. very much so.
So knowing that and asking yourself what I want and is this something I can get is a good way to at least check and see. And if it, for whatever reason, it doesn't work out, then again, you can see, well, okay, this didn't work out. Maybe I need to understand where it is going to work out versus here we go again, nothing's going to work out. And then that just perpetuates the trauma, which of course we don't want.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
What a beautiful sum up and way to start wrapping up this
Yeah.
episode. Of course, we want to thank you, Rakhi, for joining us and giving us such good insight. I feel like I'm just gonna go like reflect, maybe journal, think about some things that came up for me. And I hope that that's the same for our listeners. I hope that you, if anything, I hope that you take away a sense of validation, right? A sense of like being seen and heard that maybe you haven't before, right? Like maybe this elicits you to do more research on generational trauma or just trauma in general, or reach out to us or whoever is a mental health professional that you feel comfortable with. But as with tradition, we like to end our episodes with a quote. And I know, Rakhi, you found something earlier that you wanted to share. So I wanted to hear from you first.
Well, I found myself thinking about, and I'm not a scholar, so I don't know the actual quote, so I'm just going to reference it, but I'll then give actual quote that I found. But I've heard references to the idea of the sins of the father in the biblical context, and I don't know the actual quote itself, so I'm not truly clear what it says or what it means. But it made me think that there is this understanding that what happens to one person can affect people who come later, right? So that's all I have. That's all I thought about that particular thing. But in looking for it, I found a quote by Shakespeare, which says, "Yes, truly, for look you, the sins of the father are to be laid upon the children."
Mhm.
Wow. Yep.
Shakespeare, he would have known, huh? Like,
Uh-huh.
I feel like if anything, like he did a great job of highlighting generational trauma and trauma in general in his work. So,
Mm-hmm.
ooh, I think it's so interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I know you did the Encanto one like earlier on, but I think it's so interesting to see it play out in like even historical type works, right? Or
Mhm.
like the Bible, right? Which is like such a pivotal like read and thing for a lot of people of this isn't something that's just like for one specific belief or population. Like this is universal. Like trauma, generational trauma is universal, right? And so like hopefully that resonates maybe with people that were still having some, doubts or whatever, and encourages you to just read more into it. But I also had a quote, and now that I'm reading it, I'm like, I'm pretty sure I said like something similar to this early on. But I found this quote by, I think, Oriana Allen. Hopefully I said that right. And I really liked it. And it says, the failures of our parents may become our burden, but it is our choice to continue carrying it onward into the next generation or put it down. And I think that's maybe a good little passing the torch off to our listeners moment of like, now the ball's in your court, right? Like, what will you do with this information? Like, will you carry on these things into the next generation because maybe that feels easier and comfortable to some degree, right? Or will you put it down and probably do some really uncomfortable hard work to
Mhm.
challenge that? And not to be cliche for my Colleen Hoover like fans, but to say like it ends with us, right? Like,
Yeah.
so that's the quote that I wanted to give to kind of wrap this up. But Rakhi, we wanted to thank you so much for coming on this episode. This was such a
Yes.
good conversation, and I can't wait till you join us again. Hint, hint.
Yes.
And I know our listeners will eat this up and love this topic. And with that, listeners, we will be taking the month of June off for When Life Feels Messy content to prepare and plan for our new year of things. So you get a little hiatus from us, but hopefully that'll make, you know, the heart grow fonder for new content in July.
Of course.
With that, we will say peace out and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.